Hello everyone. Taking on another question from social media today, which I was asked, are fairies global? Or basically, can you find fairies around the world? And this is sort of a multi-layered question. On the one hand, in the sense of can you find like Celtic fairies around the world? I don't know about entirely around the whole globe, but I think we can safely say that we do see the idea of fairies from Celtic language-speaking cultures immigrating with the populations who believed in them to other places. So we find folklore relating to fairies from Ireland or Scotland or Wales, for example, in places like Canada, the United States, Australia. So pretty much wherever a population that believed in them and had their folklore and beliefs traveled to or moved to live, we then will find folklore and beliefs in place as well. So from a perspective of belief, you would argue then that yes, those beings can be found outside the countries that they would traditionally be associated with. So we see them not only just in Ireland, for example, but we can also find them in North America and in other places. Human beings move, fairies move in association with those human populations for the most part. So that's sort of one aspect of the question. Sort of the wider question gets into what exactly a fairy is, and that answer is going to depend a lot on how we're defining a fairy. If we are looking at it very narrowly and saying that a fairy is going to just be something based in the Celtic language-speaking cultures, then we're still going to find them in other places, but we would be looking for specifically what would be recognizable from the folklore and folktales of those cultures. Very specific beings, as it were. What gets tricky here is that the term fairy itself is sort of a catch-all term. It just really means any otherworldly being, something that comes from the world of fairy. And it's not a word in and of itself that is from a Celtic language. It's an English word that before that came from French, possibly before that from Latin, although the etymology gets a little difficult earlier than the 12th century. No one's entirely sure where it comes from. There's just some educated guesses, if you will. So right there we have a bit of an issue. If we're defining fairies strictly as beings that come from Celtic language-speaking cultures, which tends to be how they're often understood now, but the word itself is not a word from one of those cultures, then we're already looking at something that is a little external, if you will. Obviously, every different Celtic language culture is going to have its own specific terms for these beings. In Ireland, Aishi, Dinashi, for example, Pinamaha, would be the more common words that we're going to see used. Again, beings of the otherworld, people of the fairy hills, that sort of thing. In Wales, you have the Plantanun, children of the otherworld. You have the Tirlitheg, again, fair family. So we have these particular terms that we're going to find more associated with what we would in English call fairies. So that right there is kind of complicated. And again, every language, every Celtic language is going to have its own terms for these beings. If we're looking at them just as otherworldly beings, are we going to find them in every culture around the globe? I mean, I personally would probably argue yes. I think that when we look at cultures around the world, we can find something that's going to fit this particular description of a supernatural, if you will, a being who is from some kind of otherworld, some kind of not mortal realm, that has certain specific powers, that comes in, that is able to influence or affect humanity in some way, that seems to have some kind of symbiotic relationship to humanity in some way, and that people for thousands of years have interacted with, usually through both offerings, apotropaic, it's sort of a love-hate kind of thing, if you will. We find the major themes that we see in fairy lore playing out across different cultures. The idea that these beings, for example, have an interest in humanity on some level, but also are sometimes predatory towards humanity. That these beings will sometimes intermarry or need humans to reproduce, that they will take humans for various reasons, that they sort of fit into this semi-divine strata, if you will. But we can find beings that fit these qualifications in pretty much every culture as far as I'm aware. In North America, if you pick any particular Native American culture, again, as far as I'm aware, they're going to have some sort of beings that would fit the wider definition of what a fairy is. Where I happen to live now, the closest tribe to where I live would have beings that are called Makiawisag, and in many ways they're similar to different types of fairies that we might find. They tend to be about 3 or 4 feet tall, but look like adult human beings. Clearly they would look like the human beings who are native to this area. They do not like to be looked at directly. If you happen to come across them, you are not supposed to make eye contact or stare at them because that offends them. They can be helpful to people, particularly if people are respectful to them or reciprocal to them. But they can also cause a lot of mischief and mayhem and sometimes outright harm if you are not in a proper relationship, I guess you would say, to them. So that's one example. And they live in this world, but they also exist sort of separately to this world in what we might call another world. That gets a little more difficult when we're talking about tribal material. Not all of it has been preserved, thanks to, obviously, a lot of it being destroyed by Western culture coming in over here. If you look at a tribe like Cherokee, we have the Yunwitsindi, who are, again, little people. Literally, that's what it means, little people. Can be helpful, also sometimes not helpful. You also have the Nunahee, who are generally a little more often benevolent. But different groups of these otherworldly beings, often connected to nature, natural locations, but they're not, strictly speaking, nature spirits. And those are just 2 examples that I happen to be familiar with. Obviously, different tribal groups, different cultures. Every Native American tribe is different. They're not all just one homogeneous thing. Every group's gonna have its own beliefs, but as far as I know, everyone has something that we might roughly equate to fairies. If we go over to, for example, Asia, we're gonna find the same thing. In Korea, they have the Yuzhong. Probably mispronouncing that because my Korean's terrible, but generally it would be translated as fairy or an elf. Powerful supernatural being, usually considered kind of benevolent, but can be dangerous. Pretty much anywhere you look around the globe, you're going to find something that fits this sort of wider pattern, wider fairy lore concept. Now, a more complicated question is really, should we be calling them fairies? And that gets difficult. I think that we do need to be a little cautious in just directly translating and calling everything a fairy. It's a really useful generic term that we can use to sort of group these beings together that all fit into this classification. But I do think we need to be careful about how exactly we're translating things. Another thing that we see in Korea, for example, is the dokebi. It's often translated as goblin, but it's actually very different from what the Western concept of a goblin would be. Very, very different. Closer to like a demigod spirit than what we would consider a goblin. So I think when we start translating into English specific types of beings, we do need to be a little cautious that we're not losing the nuances. Sometimes it's better to stick with the actual name of the being in the original culture so that we understand it better as an individual being, and use fairy the way it has been used for centuries and centuries as this sort of generic term. So that all said, my point really is that yes, I do think that we can find fairies all around the world. I do think they're sort of a global phenomenon, these otherworldly beings that there's beliefs and practices connecting human culture to them or them to human culture. But I think we need to respect the individual cultures and the individual beings as they manifest to those cultures, and look at studying them and understanding them on that level rather than homogenizing them too much or generalizing them too much. We need to just be cautious. I often say that the term fairy is kind of like the term animal, and I think as long as we sort of keep that in perspective, that yes, you can find animals all around the world, but there's a really big difference between a hyena and a wolf and skunk. Oh, just picking three random ones. Even though they might have a lot of surface similarities, and that's not even getting into, you know, insects or fish or, you know, the wide array of animals that are out there. So you can look at fairy lore from all around the world. You're going to find it all around the world, and it's a pretty fascinating topic to study. But if you're interested in the fairy lore of a specific area or specific culture, you know, I highly recommend really digging in to the stories and the anecdotes of that area, of that culture, to get to understand them. You know, as I've said, or I've written about previously, I don't know if I've actually said this in a video yet, one of the closest cousins to the Irish Aishi, as far as I'm aware, are probably the Norse Alfar. There's a lot of similarities between the two, between the beliefs about the two, practices related to them, what they like for offerings, anecdotal accounts, but they're not identical. There are important differences. The Alfar generally tend to be a lot nicer in interactions with humans, which isn't to say they aren't still dangerous, but generally a lot nicer in interactions with humans, whereas the Aishi are definitely a little more strict and grade on a lot less of a curve. So even when we're looking at types of fairy beings that are fairly closely related, culturally speaking, we need to keep in mind that they're not going to be identical, that there are going to be differences. We could see this for another example if we look at the water horse, which is a type of fairy that we see in the Celtic language cultures. We find them in Scotland, in Ireland, in Wales, and on the Isle of Man. But each four of those places, they're going to be slightly different. When we look at the folklore, we can make general statements about them. They're all predatory. They will all eat human beings. They all generally like to trick people into riding them before rushing into bodies of water and drowning them and then eating them. But in actual practicality, when we look at the individual folklore associated with the four different types, although the Irish and Scottish are very similar to each other, the Welsh and the Manx have some notable differences. So we just need to be really careful not to overgeneralize, even within closely related cultures. And when you broaden that out to look at cultures that have a lot of diversity or have very minimal connections to each other, or really no connections to each other, you're going to find that there's more differences sometimes than similarities. beyond the really broad strokes, which I mentioned at the beginning, that sort of overarching what makes them fit that definition that we might apply to the word fairy in this sense. And you may sometimes also run across different cultures or groups who are just not comfortable with the idea of referring to certain beings by the anglicized term fairy, and you have to respect that. If they don't feel that their particular otherworldly beings should be called fairies, then we don't call them fairies. You know, always respect whatever root culture it is that you're looking at, in my opinion. But hopefully this has answered the question of, can we find fairies globally, and touched on a little bit of why it's sort of a nuanced answer. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop a comment on the video. Otherwise, I'll try to make another video soon. Have a good day.